Well, good evening, friends. My name is Mark Valeri, and as the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, I welcome you, those of you here in Graham Chapel and those in our campus overflow spaces and those watching this from off campus, to this conversation with Heather Cox Richardson about democracy awakening. A quick word about who we are as a center, bringing scholars together who study various aspects of religion and politics in American history and society. This center is named in honor of Senator John C. Danforth. An academic unit of Washington University, it is designed to nourish scholarship on and foster a pluralistic and democratic public discourse. We have had plenty of help from around the campus in putting together this event, and I want to thank especially the center's coordinator of events, Hannah Pierce, and assistant director, Deborah Kennard. Following an initial talk by Professor Richardson and conversation between her and Center Professor Laurie Maffly-Kipp, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from those here in Graham Chapel. Staff have been handing out cards with pens or pencils for you to record your questions. If you have a question for Professor Richardson, please use one of the cards and pass it to the outside aisles. Staff will collect them in a few minutes from now and later during our discussion. After the discussion, we invite you to join us in one of two receptions in Umrath Lounge and in the Danforth University Center. These are nearby, and staff will be outside to direct you, and Professor Richardson will be visiting both receptions. So now's the time, if you haven't yet done so, to silence your cell phones. So, to introduce our speakers for this evening, Laurie Maffly-Kipp is the Archer Alexander Distinguished Professor at Washington University. Receiving her PhD from Yale University, she taught for 24 years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill before coming to this center. Attentive to a wide range of American religious movements during the 19th century, she has authored books and essays on religion and gold mining in California, Mormonism in the Pacific world, African American race histories, and the creation of new scriptures. Professor Maffly-Kipp currently is working on a survey of the Latter-day Saints as a global movement. Honored with the James W.C. Pennington Award from Heidelberg University in Germany, she is past president of the American Society of Church History and the Mormon History Association. Heather Cox Richardson is professor of history at Boston College. Receiving her PhD from Harvard University, she taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology before moving to Boston. Many of us know her best through her newsletter, Letters from an American, and the podcast that she co-hosts, Now and Then. Professor Richardson has focused her historical writings on the Civil War and Reconstruction periods, with books and essays on Civil War economic policies, the political forces that betrayed democratic reform in the South following the Civil War, economic and political oligarchies in the American West, Wounded Knee, Abraham Lincoln, the history of the Republican Party, and voter suppression. Her latest work and one focus for this evening's event, the New York Times bestseller Democracy Awakening, is both history and contemporary political observation. She has garnered several awards and honors for her work, including the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Best Solo Newsletter Award from the American Journalism Association Online Awards at NYU, and election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Throughout her work, Professor Richardson has probed a past and present that reflects deep tensions in America between democracy and egalitarianism on one hand and oligarchy and authoritarianism on the other. She writes with eloquence and remarkably clear language, compelling us to consider the reasons for the vexed state of our current politics. Lauded for her moral astuteness and political wisdom, she offers us insight. Moreover, she prompts us to reinvigorate the better traditions of American democracy. So please join me in welcoming Heather Cox Richardson and Laurie Maffly-Kipp to this stage.
So, first of all, I want to thank the Danforth Center and WashU for inviting me here tonight. And I want to thank you all for coming, both the people who are here in person and the people who are in the overflow rooms. But I want to warn you that you think you're going to hear the sort of stuff you usually hear from me, but in fact, the director of the Danforth Center gave me a very specific assignment tonight. And I'm really excited by it. So I'm going to try out some ideas here that I have not talked about elsewhere. And I hope they fly, and if they don't, you can all just, the doors are back there. So he asked me to talk about the issues of religion and politics for a humanist. How do those things fit together for a humanist? And the way to start that, I think, is by defining what a humanist is, because that's really important. And I'm taking the argument or the position that a humanist is somebody who believes in human rather than divine answers to societal issues. And in that, I could not be more closely identified. And I would also argue that that idea of humanism as an answer to American society's issues is central to our American tradition, especially our political tradition. So let me start with the idea that, in fact, that has been a central question of American society since the Puritans. Because if you think about Puritanism, one of the really driving features of Puritanism, have I lost you already? The issue of Puritanism and the driving force behind Puritanism is the idea of having a super relationship with God, a direct relationship with God, which is, of course, what made Puritans talk about how hot they were for religion and how concerned they were about the future life. But at the same time, it's really hard to create a society in which everybody has a hotline to God, because God doesn't speak the same way to everybody. And this is a problem that the Puritans had to grapple with, and as you probably know, one of the ways they grappled with it, they had a lot of religious ways to grapple with it, but they came up with a series of very strict social and legal parameters to make sure that people hemmed in their relationship with God and kept it personal rather than trying to spread it across society. And it all kind of blows up in their face in the 1630s when Anne Hutchinson says to the leaders of society, well, I've got my own hotline to God, and he doesn't agree with what you're saying. And that, of course, leads her to be exiled to New York. Can't imagine a worse fate, right? But I'm joking, because she actually did not have a good time in New York. But I think that issue of the personal relationship with God and how you translate that to a stable and just society has really been a central issue in American society ever since. And after the founding of the American Republic, that really worked its way into American literature. So if you think about the greats in American literature before the Civil War, you all had to drag yourself through the Scarlet Letter, right? That's really a question about societal values versus your personal relationship with God, right? And I don't mean that quite literally with Hester Prynne's personal relationship with the minister, but rather her relationship with love, right? And she owns that. She wears that scarlet letter. But of course, she's ostracized by society. So you have that strand moving into American literature. But quite specifically, it does not enter into American governance after the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence really quite deliberately turns its back on the idea of a society founded in a relationship with God. And it does so quite specifically because people like James Madison are really concerned about the idea of the government deciding what somebody can and can't believe. And what Madison is upset about is not the sorts of things we're upset about now, but rather the fact that in the Virginia in which he grew up, there were such distinctions among different Protestant groups that certain Protestant groups were being jailed for their practices, even though there weren't huge rifts between what they thought and what a different Protestant church thought. And he recognized pretty early on that if the government got involved in what he called matters of conscience, pretty soon there were going to be wars, because that's where things would go. If your God told you to do something and my God told me to do something else, what were our choices but to fight with each other? So that being the case, he decided you had to form a society on a basis that did not involve divine intervention. Rather, we needed a society based in the rule of law and in Enlightenment principles that said that everybody was created equal and everybody had a right to have a say in their government. Now, of course, that's a very limited idea when he talks about it and when people like him talk about it in the 1770s and the 1780s. But they're adamant that society must be formed on human values and on values that can be defined on a piece of paper as opposed to some sort of divine inspiration. That idea of the Enlightenment values behind the Declaration of Independence, the idea that we are all created equal and we have a right to a say in our government, both of which are in the Declaration of Independence, and the idea of a government that is based in law is what made America so incredibly special. But it also, early on, meant that it was hard for people to be informed and for their governmental understanding to be informed by their specific morality. So one of the things that gets Abraham Lincoln into really big trouble is that a lot of people say, hey, you don't believe in human enslavement either, get rid of it. And he says, I can't because I have to live by the rule of law. So if you think, for example, about the Emancipation Proclamation, which one historian called about as exciting as a bill of lading, that is, the things that say what's on a ferry, he does that because he wants to be sure he is standing on the law. He is standing on those legal principles. So I'm going to accept the idea that I am a humanist, but I want to emphasize that that does not necessarily mean that you are divorced from whatever your form of spirituality is. It means when you're trying to solve human problems, you look for human solutions, because that's how we all get to have a say in that government. Are you with me so far? Okay. So, back to the original question, how does a humanist look at the relationship between religion and politics? Because it's kind of everywhere, right? And I would make this argument. Y'all can't wait, can you? When I look at the world, many people make the mistake of thinking I'm a partisan or that I am taking sides in issues, but this is the way I look at the world. That politics, at least in the United States, which is all I can speak to, is about power. Most of us just want to get along. You know, we don't want control over other people. We want to put food on the table. We want to, have some fun with our friends. We want to have our lives, and we don't give a lot of thought to controlling other people. But there are some people who want power. How do they get it? Well, what I argue in my work is that politicians in the United States, because it doesn't have to be this way, but in the United States, they garner power through the use of narrative, through the use of stories. And to garner power in the United States and to make people afraid of each other, they use a lot of tools. In America, they use race a lot. They use gender. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to mean black and white, doesn't necessarily have to mean male, female. It could be the same sorts of language that, for example, make some members of an inner city area turn against a grocer who's from another ethnic group that might not be included in a black-white exchange at all, but that is included in that narrative that says those are people to be afraid of. In the United States, in the moment in which we are living, religion has been used as one of those issues to create fear and to garner power. That's my take on it, and that's what I talk about in this book. But it doesn't have to be that way. That religion can also be used as a political issue to bring people together. And one of the things that I've been watching really closely right now is the rise of people like Shawn Fain, who is the president of the United Auto Workers, who is very open about his commitment to Christianity and uses it to talk about inclusion and to talk about ordinary people having power, not to talk about how you need to fear those people and therefore vote for me. So it doesn't have to be used in a divisive way and in a way that garners power for a very small group of people, but it can be. So I see religion in the modern era in America as part of a narrative, part of a political narrative that has been used for a certain group of people to garner power. But I want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be. And I could talk to you about different times in history when it has been used otherwise. But I think the ultimate question here, when you talk about that idea of humanism and the idea of looking at human problems, human answers for human problems, rather than hoping for a divine intervention, or a divine answer through the scriptures or whatever, to a human problem. The question then is there any role for religion in American politics? And what I would say, what my answer would be to that, is that your politics should be informed by your faith, whatever that faith is, because you are bringing to human society your beliefs about the way the universe works, and that's crucially important. But when faith begins to be used as part of a narrative to garner power for a very small group of people who want to impose their will on the rest of us, it overturns those Enlightenment values that people like Madison wrote into our Constitution. And when it does that, by overturning those values, those human values, those values of being created equal and having a right to a say in our government, it is no longer about faith, and it's about power. And when that happens, first of all, it undermines the entire democratic project in the United States, the idea of creating a polity in which people have the right to determine their own fate, which is, I think, the ultimate human project. The idea that we get to decide who we're going to be seems to me to be the ultimate end of humanity. When it does that, I think it behooves not only people like me to call it out, which I do on a daily basis. If you follow me on Twitter, you know I have a really big problem with a couple people. But I think more importantly, it behooves people of faith to say, that's not what I believe, and that's not my religion. That's you trying to use my religion to get power for yourself. And when you do that, you're not only undermining the Enlightenment project, the human project, the project of humanists, but you're also undermining religion and the project of faith and of divinity, if in fact you believe in the divine. So there is how I think religion and politics fit together for a humanist. And I hope it made sense and made you think about some stuff. And now we're going to talk about answering questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's great to have you here, and I appreciate your words. I want to start our conversation now by talking about your process. I am also a historian, And I'm curious about how it is that you think about your work, not to get too into the weeds for those of you who are not historians, but the fact is you were not trained as a commentator of contemporary politics, but as a historian. And I wonder how it is that your interest in the 19th century led you, or did it, to do the work that you're doing now in contemporary politics.
So I love you say that I shouldn't get in the weeds because I just talked about Anne Hutchinson. Just saying. What historians do, as you well know, is very different than what journalists do. Journalists tell you what happened, and they break stories, and they make sure that you know what's happening out there. But that's not how we're trained. Our stories that we break happened in like 1872, right? It's hardly new news. What we do and what we are trained to do, and there's a lot of training behind it in theory, in writing, in making arguments, in understanding the world, what we do is we study how societies change. And that means that as a historian looking at the modern era, I am not always very interested in breaking news, because there's a lot of news that breaks that doesn't move any balls forward at all. Those don't interest me. And I'm really not interested in what might happen. Because that might interest a journalist, but it doesn't interest a historian, because why do we care? I'm interested in things that happen that move society forward or backward, that create change in society. So I was trained in that sense, and I'm always very careful to say I am not a journalist. Even though sometimes I do get stories, I'm looking at the larger sweep of American history in this moment and trying to identify things every day that change the story. So, some of you watched today me looking through the news and saying, don't care, don't care, don't care, major stories don't care. Oh, but look at this. Look at this. This moved the ball a little bit. And what's really interesting to me about that is that if you look through the long period of the stuff I've done, I often see things much earlier than other people do. And it's not because I know anything that other people don't. It's that I've been trained for it. We've both been very well trained.
Yeah, you've seen a lot of those things before, or seen another form of them,
seen another form. That's it.
Yeah, and part of what that brings up, I think, is the role of training about contingency in history, and that's a fancy word for saying that events happen, but they can't necessarily be predicted ahead of time, or we don't know how things will turn out. So no matter how bleak they might look at a certain point, there are possibilities for the future. And it seems to me that that's part of what you open up for us, is possibility in what might come in the future.
Possibility and also agency. So possibility is a great one. I don't know about you all, but didn't they start talking about the 2024 election in like 1962? Like somebody, it was right after the midterms last year, and some news person called and said, what do you think is going to happen in 2024? I'm like, I don't even know what we're having for dinner tonight. Why do you think I know what's going to happen in 2024? Because that's a long way away. Even now, it's a long way away. So if you were thinking about the world in January of 2022, you could have written down a whole bunch of stuff that was going to happen. Did you ever think that what was going to be the most important thing going forward for until the present was the president of Ukraine, most of people didn't even know his name in the United States, saying, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. Who saw that coming? I mean, you might have seen the invasion, although everybody said, ooh, don't do it, Putin, it's going to be a really bad idea. So they didn't think he'd do it. But then it was very clear what was going to happen. The U.S. was going to go in and they were going to take the Zelensky government out. It was going to be a government in exile, the same way that the Afghan government, by the way, is not the Taliban. They're not recognized. It's the Afghan government in exile. And they said, are you ready to go? And he said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. So the whole world changed. And that's one of the things I think that historians have the advantage over people thinking they can predict, is because we know you just never know what's going to come next. I was looking at a story the other day, wrote a whole piece on it. Fortunately, someone said, hold it, it's not right yet. Because what happened was absolutely different than every reporter said was going to happen. And yeah, that's the advantage that historians have, is we wait till it's already happened.
So I came across a quote about you by Bill Moyers, who said that journalists live in a world of thunderstorms, but that you watch the waves come in. And I love that quote. I wonder if you, could talk about that. Given all the thunderstorms that we see every day, how do you find the waves?
Well, I will talk about that, but don't you think that's right as historians? We tend to look at the
long
I mean, it's not like you look at the news and you get really, but then there's part of you, especially if you read a lot of it, you're like, really, we're doing this again? You know, oh, look, another story on the same.
We're like the jaded older sisters. Yeah. Who always, oh yeah, we've been there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what was the question? How do I find stories? How
do you find the waves as opposed to the thunderstorms?
Well, I'm looking for stories about democracy. And I'm looking for, not stories about democracy, I'm interested in the human project in the United States of America and the construction of American democracy. That's all I'm interested in. Except for the fact I'm also really interested in the divorce between what people think is happening from what is really happening. And that has always been really interesting to me because I was a waitress in Oklahoma for a while. And I was the only person on the floor who wasn't an evangelical Christian. And it was in the 80s. And they were all fervent Republicans, fervent, Ronald Reagan Republicans. And literally one of them called me the Antichrist because I'd gone to Harvard and I'd put education between me and God. And I was looking at them, and I was not political at all. And I was looking at them and I'm like, you are literally supporting somebody who's cut everything you need. They were all living on the poverty line. And yet the people who are trying to help you, you're saying are against you. And I found that so fascinating. I had spent a lot of time doing folklore and mythology, which is actually how I ran into Bill Moyers at first, because he had that wonderful series with Joseph Campbell. So I read Jung and all that after that. And I thought, this is a really interesting delta between what people think and what's real. And so that's a lot of what I do, is looking for what's real. But versus what people think. But when I'm looking for what I'm gonna write about, I have likened it before to the cement coming out of a cement truck, and I think you'll understand this. If you do it enough, you know what it looks like. Like you can read through, I'm sure you look through the Mormon papers and you're like, oh, more of that, more of that, more of that, more of that. But then if all of a sudden they made, Andrew Carnegie, the king of whatever, you'd be like, oh, wow, something unusual is happening here. And that's how I think about it, like the concrete coming out of the truck. The cement, I'm sorry, it's not concrete. The cement, I've been corrected. The cement coming out of a truck. You just watch it. It's very mesmerizing, actually. But if all of a sudden there were a child's toy, you'd think, uh-oh, I got to look at that. Or a leaping fish. You'd think, oh, that's something. So one of the stories, for example, that you're always looking for something that's a little bit different. So I was saying one of the stories that I have been watching is there was a vote in Venezuela last night, what is today, Monday, on Sunday, about whether or not to vote to claim about 2/3 of Guyana, which is a neighboring country. And you'd think, why on earth is Richardson interested in that? Because she could probably not find Guyana on a map before about 2 weeks ago. And the answer to that is we are in a period in which there are enormous challenges to the rules-based international order. And the idea of taking over another country, even on paper, mind you, that's not clear at all where this is going to go. There's a lot of contingency over this. But the fact that Venezuela was playing with that idea, the same way that Russia has tried in Ukraine, the same way that other countries are challenging it, I thought, ooh, South America. Interesting, South America. So I look for those sorts of things that are, that boundary was set in 1899, and it's not something that's been on the table until after 2015. And, we know Venezuela is backed by Russia, so it's interesting.
Yeah. I want to turn to the difference between writing a book. You've written lots of books, and you've written just this new book that many people have read or will read. But you also write your Substack sort of letters. And I wonder for you what you see as the different or added value of writing for Substack on a daily basis versus writing a book. They're very different kinds of processes.
So that's a really great question. And for those of you here who are writers, this was a really interesting thing for me because I agreed to write the book because I figured I'd write an essay every night, how hard it can be to write a chapter during the day. Psychologically, I found it fascinating because I sat in the exact same spot with the exact same chair, the exact same laptop, the exact same music on the radio. Everything was the same. When I sit down to write the letters at night, I write the letters. They take many hours, but it's not like I sit there not able to do it. Everything was exactly the same. When I went to write that stupid book, I would sit there and I'd be like, ooh, the bathroom needs cleaning. Oh, better do some laundry. And which every writer will tell you, right? And again, if you follow me on Instagram, I started posting pictures of what we in the know called procrastinating. Because I'm like, oh, look, I have never made chocolate chip, peppermint stick frosted cookies before. That seems like it's a good idea. So I thought that was fascinating. Same person, same day, same everything, letters, no problem. The book, I did everything I do with a book, which I don't know, we got psychologists here. I thought that was fascinating. But the added value is that they're really different projects. They're entirely different projects. So the letters are, I hope, essays that stand alone, but that are part of I think of them, I call them a kaleidoscope, and somebody said, no, they're facets of a jewel. The jewel is American democracy, and every night you look at it through a different facet. And I really like that because it's a real mistake to read a single letter and think that's everything I talk about. And always, every single day, somebody has read one letter and written to me and said, well, why didn't you talk about whatever? I'm like, 1,200 words, dude, come on. But look, there's years more back there that you could go back and search, and you'd see I've written about this from 16 different perspectives at this time. So that's a much shorter and a much more immediate attempt to explain the world. Books give you, again, this trajectory of how the world changes. And that, it just gives you so much more scope to do that and to make a larger argument about society. There is no larger plan behind the letters every night. It's not like I'm making an argument. My books all make an argument.
Do you find that people respond differently to the Substack than they do to the book? I mean, I know you read lots of comments that people have written to you on both.
Well, the funny thing is I can tell you how people react to the Substack, but I tend not to go back. I don't read book reviews, and I tend not to read. Do people comment on books? Do they? I mean,
Well, I assume you've gotten sort of personal, people have written to you and said, I read your book, and...
I just don't look back at the books. Yeah. The funny thing is that when I reread the book, the first time I wrote the book, I wrote it as a series of essays to answer the questions people ask me every day. And the biggest question they ask me every day is, how did we get here? Where are we? And how do we get out? So that was the organization for the book, which made, I never thought of anything else. And 4 people have now said to me, woo, it was a really weird organization of the book. And I thought, I really don't know how else I could have done it. But what was interesting is I set it aside without going back over it. And when I picked it up again, I didn't think there was an argument in the book. And when I picked it up, and I wasn't happy with it, it didn't sing, which I was saying to you earlier. One of the things the letters has done is it's made me a good writer. Like, I'd written books before, but I was a competent writer. Like, I think I'm a good writer now. And you know why? Is because somebody said to me, before I started the letters, probably 6 years ago, he's brilliant, he's just a lyrical, beautiful writer. I said, how do you do it? How do you do that? And he said, well, can't you hear it? And I was like, hear what? I don't hear anything. I can hear it now. And that really makes a big, you can hear it. You can hear it in your head. But when I picked it back up, it was telling a story, and that's why the book is dedicated to you all, is because it felt like as a teacher, often you teach people things, and then if you leave them with that material, they create something entirely new that you can admire, and maybe you can see traces of yourself in it, but it's really them, it's not you. And that's what this book felt like, because when I came back to it, what was there was the story of how narrative breaks down democracy, or can be used to break down democracy, along with the use of false history, how the former President Donald Trump and his people turned that into a movement. But it also gave me the last piece, which is how Americans reclaim that and reclaim both their language, their history, and their agency to reclaim American democracy. So that trajectory created the book that was there, but then I read it. I rewrote about 80% of it, and you know, it was decent. But then I read it again, you know, after page proofs or whatever. I got to that second section, and I literally called my agent and I said, "We got a huge problem. No one's going to finish this book because this second section is terrifying. It is. You strip the noise out of that second section, and you realize how close we came to losing our democracy altogether." And that, I think, was, for me, the feedback you're talking about, the sense of there's more here than I wrote, even though it was my hand. And it was my reaction to it, I think. And lots of people have said that. They're like, I'm in the second section, you know, I need to be talked off the ledge. You know, get me to the third section, the happy section.
Yeah. So let's turn to politics a little more specifically, maybe delve into the harder parts. The word Republican these days seems to refer mostly to MAGA politics, or it seems to have been co-opted in that direction. And I wonder, is there room left for what you have called Lincoln Republicans? And can you talk more about what that means to you?
So I love this question, and I'm really careful about it. And lots of people, I'm really careful with my words, so I do not call the current day Republican Party conservatives. They are not conservatives. They are radical extremists. There are conservatives in America. I'm going to call out here Judge Michael Ludig, George Conway. I'm going with lawyers because we were talking about lawyers over dinner. But there are conservatives in this country. They're not the MAGA Republicans who have taken over a once grand party and weaponized it against the majority of Americans. And I'm very careful about that. I've written a book on the Republican Party. I would venture that there's nobody in this country who knows that party better than I do. And I say that with a broken heart. I think about 2 months ago I said the party is dead, which people have been asking me to kill it off now for 25 years. And I'm like, no. No, it does this. It's going to come back. It's going to rebuild itself. But the modern day version of the Republican Party is done. It is not necessarily politically done, but as a legitimate political party in the United States of America, it is no longer. However, the principles of the Republican Party on which they were formed largely in 1859. So the party is going to form earlier. The party is going to be formed by about 1856. Starts to form in 1854. Actually, it's a really cool story. It starts to form in 1854 after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to open up the remaining parts of the Louisiana Purchase to enslavement. This is a huge deal because it means slavery is going to be able to move into those regions of the American West that are going to enable those western areas to become slave states, which can work with the southern slave states to take over the north, and America is going to be a slave country. They're really articulate about this is what they want to do, the elite enslavers are. So the night after that law passes the House of Representatives, a whole bunch of people in Washington, lawmakers, get together in a series of rooms in the boarding house in Washington. They all lived in boarding houses at the time, that had the best food, because even then, lawmakers were not stupid. They're like, you can go anywhere. Let's go where they have the best food. But you know where they meet? They meet in the rooms of Dickinson from Massachusetts. And Dickinson had a very talented daughter. Literally, Emily Dickinson's father is the room where they all meet to form the Republican Party. How cool is that? Like, 6 people in the 19th century, and they do the rest with mirrors. But by 59, Lincoln has articulated a new vision of American society, and it's really important because it is not the opposite of the Democrats, which form in the 1830s and have a very specific kind of ideology. That focuses primarily on the haves versus the have-nots and how that plays out in federalism and state power. The Republicans under Lincoln come up with a new way of thinking about government that says that the government should not focus on a closed system, if you will, in which there's a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, but rather they should focus on making sure that people who are starting out, men of course, who are starting out have access to resources and to equality before the law and a say in their government. Lincoln is really articulate about this. In 1859, he gives a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in which he talks about how this stands against the idea of basically the elite enslavers taking over the country. And his argument is that if you put money at the bottom, if the government supports people at the bottom through education and through internal improvements and through fair laws, they're going to produce more than they can consume, and that is going to, I'm watching you, you're reacting to this because you know exactly the stuff I'm talking about. They're going to produce more than they can consume. It's going to go up to the next level. They're going to create more than they consume. It's going to go up to a very few industrialists who in turn will hire people at the bottom. It's sort of this web of society, very much in contrast to what the Democrats are talking about. And I would argue, and have argued within the last 2 weeks to somebody who wants to start a new political party, that idea of how society should work is so deeply ingrained in the American DNA, because it's been here since 1859, that even if it's not the Republican Party that embraces that again, somebody is going to bring that back to the American polity in some form. And somebody is already talking about forming a new political party in this moment. Whether or not it's going to happen, who knows, but is there room for that? Not only is there room for it, everything is in place.
And there's lots of precedent for new political parties forming. And we've lived with a particular formation for a long time, but as you're pointing out, that's not inevitable, and it has changed over time in the past.
Well, interestingly, the reason for many years I kept saying, would you stop with the Republican Party is dying? The Republican Party is not dying. It's going through one of its normal we're crazy things, but it's going to come back, right? It always does, right? So, and I could walk you through each one of those. They end up giving everything to the rich, and then they're reborn. They've done it repeatedly. But I always said they're not going to do that. They're not going to dissolve because of the institutions. That is, the state parties especially, and the money and they used to be mailing lists. Now they're email lists. But many people don't know that when Trump was in office, his people very deliberately took over state parties. And when they took over those state parties, first of all, they corrupted the email lists, because those email lists are not just about voting at this point, they're also about raising money. And they're about raising money not only for politics, but for the various grifts that are part of what is currently the MAGA Republicans. So those email lists are corrupted. They're no longer incredibly valuable. They're valuable, but they're not necessarily valuable for politics, one. And two, by taking over those political parties at the state level, they've run a lot of them into the ground. So Michigan is, I don't think they got any money at all. And I may have the states wrong, but there are at least 2 state parties that are out of money. OOM, out of money. And there are a number that are so deeply involved in legal fights that they really can't do anything. So it's not like you're saying, oh, well, good luck with that. We're the Michigan Republican Party and we have more money than God. You're saying we're having a fight over who should be in charge of the party because it's run us into the ground. And similarly, there's a fight over the head of the RNC. Ronna McDaniel is not popular within the rank and file, and she's in trouble as well with January 6th, events of January 6th. So this is, if there's going to be a new political party rising around the Republicans or out of the Republicans, now is quite literally the moment. So if anybody is looking for something to do this week, now is your moment.
You say in the conclusion of your book that American democracy is never finished. I love that phrase. And you love Abraham Lincoln, I know, and you quote him at the end saying that it was a form of the eternal struggle between the two principles of right and wrong throughout the world. And I wonder if you could say more about that. That's not exactly a religious point in any straightforward way, but it's a deeply moral point that you're making. And I wonder if you could say more about what you mean by that.
Faith is the operative word in much of what I write. But it's a faith in democracy, humanism, if you will. I think one of the important ways to look at the moment we're in, and in American history in general, is that we have always had a struggle between the idea on the one hand that some people are better than others and have the right and maybe the dual duty to rule over the rest of us, and people who believe in equality before the law and a right to have a say in our government. And those two strands have run through American history, but one of the things that I think is important to really grapple with in this moment, but also in our history, is that many Americans tend to associate the idea of that first one, the idea some people are better than others and have the right to rule, with the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1920s, especially from Benito Mussolini in Italy, and then, of course, his imitator, Adolf Hitler in Germany. But we know, historians know, that Hitler's lawyers looked to the United States, to the Jim Crow laws and the Juan Crow laws and the Native American reservations to come up with ways in which to draw racial lines within their own society. So that idea of some people being better than others runs all the way back to the Puritans or before. I think I say the first time a European dropped anchor off the North American continent. That ties into the history that you're identifying, because I think the important takeaway of this book is that the idea of there being a perfect past, I just love that. Like when? Like February 18th, 1923, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, was that the minute it was perfect? Because the idea that there's something perfect in the past, I think serves authoritarians. Because it says we can get back to that. We can go back to when we were great. If only we get rid of these people who are standing in the way of these universal laws, either provided by a divine power or by tradition, that will take us back to that moment we were great. So all we got to do is get rid of these people in our way and go back to that moment. And go back to those rules and get us back to that moment. But democracy is different. Democracy says, we're never done. We're never going to get to that perfect moment. We're always in flux. But we will grapple with that bad strand of our history by recognizing that the reason that liberal democracy has continued and expanded since it was first conceived in the colonies with the Declaration of Independence, because marginalized Americans who have been excluded from that polity have said, this is a great idea. Everybody's created equal and has a right to a say in their government. What about me? And that's happened since the very day after they penned the Declaration of Independence. And that idea of history, that idea of ordinary people having agency, seems to me to be the diametrical opposite to, trust me, I can take us back to that perfect moment. You just sit and I'll do it. This says we can do it if we put skin in the game and recognize it's going to be a lot of work, but we can not only reclaim democracy, we can make it better. And how do we know that? Because we've been doing it since 1776.
So you're making me think of a question that we didn't talk about before, and that is about how we repair the past. You know, how we repair the past. Not reparations specifically, but there are all kinds of ways in which today people are concerned about do we take down the statues or do we keep them up? Do we rename the buildings or do we keep them the same? And I wonder if you've had thoughts about some of those issues, about what we do about that past, rather than, obviously trying to improve is one piece of that, but there are calls for some kind of recollection of the past that will help us to move forward.
So, yes, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, there are no statues or commemorations in any way of the Confederate States of America on any federal property ever under any circumstances. They freaking tried to destroy the United States of America. But that's quite different than saying you can't have it in your own home or whatever. That's really important. That they tried to destroy the United States. And there was a period when if you said that, people were like, well, that's not really what happened. I'm like, yes, it is. This is what happened. But then when we talk about that to me is just, you can hear I'm inarticulate. I was once on a TV show with somebody about this, and they're like, well, I think, I'm like, no, you tried to destroy the United States. But then there's a difference between commemoration and history. And I think that's a really important distinction, because when we commemorate somebody, and I always pick on Amelia Earhart here, and I don't know why, because I don't really know much about Amelia Earhart. But, no, you know what I'll do? I'll pick on Andrew Jackson. I don't like Andrew Jackson, and I just can't even tell you how many reasons I don't like Andrew Jackson. But he's on our $20 bill. That's a problem today, that he's on that $20 bill, because we all know now of his history with regard to Indigenous people. I have my own personal reasons for disliking him because of his stand in a couple of speeches, but the rest of you probably don't care a lot. But he was really important to have there in the 1930s, which is when they put him on there, because in the 1930s, he represented a fight against the banks. We were commemorating the idea of people being against the banks. And one of the things that I think about when we think about renaming things and doing all this is recognizing that you can honor somebody for a position that matters in that moment without buying into their stances. Here's a big one for me, their stances on women. If we get rid of all the misogynist statues and names we got here, there ain't none left, right? We're gonna be like MIT and we're gonna have to name them all, right? Number them all. But I'm actually not supporting the idea of getting rid of the people that we honor for their civil rights stances or their whatever. So what I would say is that it's important to remember the difference between commemoration and history, and that I really, truly do not understand why there is such resistance to changing statues. I mean, certainly explaining them and you hear all, but changing statues and saying, we really, really, really needed Andrew Jackson to talk about banks, but now we don't. Now we need Wilma Mankiller because, she's the one I would like. Or you know who I wanted on the 20? Frances Perkins. I wanted Frances Perkins on the 20. And you know why I wanted her? Because, and that's why I went with Wilma Mankiller too, is because our money commemorates people who have been in government. So one of the, and they've gotten around that with Harriet Tubman by saying that she was sort of unofficially part of the army. But Frances Perkins, man, she was all over it. And similarly, Wilma Mankiller, I'm not sure I don't think she was ever part of the federal government, but she certainly was part of tribal government, and that counts. Mm-hmm. So.
Good. Let's turn to religion and politics. And you've anticipated some of my questions already in your introduction. But it seemed to me in reading your book, you presented sort of religion in a uniformly detrimental role. It was hierarchical, oppressive, and seemed to work against the continuation of democratic values. So now I'm giving you the chance. You mentioned that you could cite the other side of this and that there were some other examples, but I wanted you to talk some about countervailing examples that you saw.
Okay, so that I think that's legit. I also think that one of the things that is important about Democracy Awakening is it's 250 pages, and it does tell the story of how we got here, where are we, and how we get out. So there's, somebody said, you don't really talk about the Democrats. And I'm like, well, I talk about how they mess up sometimes, but they're really not the story of how we got here, if you're looking at narratives, because the whole point was they didn't have a narrative. So I think you're right that I identify religion primarily in this book, and I think that's a legitimate criticism, by the way, of the letters as well. I don't do religion very well, frankly, because it's a really complicated topic, and I'm really good at the early years, but not so much I do the basic stuff, the Southern Baptists and all that. But anyway, so the book talks about the use of evangelicals by the Reagan administration, in part because they recognized that they didn't have the votes they needed to preserve the 1986 tax cuts. And so they very deliberately brought evangelicals who previously had tended to shun political participation into the fold. And then I also talked really briefly, and it bothered me because it needed more space, is the split in the Southern Baptists. Because that's such an important split, especially now that we have the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, having been part of the law school named for one of the Southern Baptists who took over the denomination and turned it very much into a hierarchical, misogynistic group. But that, I'm not even sure I dealt with how that's broken apart lately. I've written about that in the letters, but I'm not sure I've written about how that's broken. I'm not sure if it's in the book or not. But I think that idea of a narrative and how a narrative either supports or condemns democracy encompasses religion as well. Because it does not have to be weaponized. None of these issues have to be weaponized. So the issue of race, for example, which has been so thoroughly weaponized nowadays, think about the 1960s. Think about how, rather than being a dividing issue, it was a uniting issue. Think about, Jimmy Carter, when he took over Georgia as governor, saying, the time for segregation is over. And if you think about Jimmy Carter, as I know you do on a regular basis, think about when he went into office in 76. Think about who supported him in 75. You got the Allman Brothers. You've got Leonard Skinner. You've got, I think, Charlie Daniels. He's got this incredible list of people who follow him. That's 75. That's the same year that Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run just blows everybody out of the water. You think about that period in which all of these issues, at least the issues of race and class, were all in the blender, and they could have come out any possible way. And they came out in a certain way, but they did not have to. And I look at issues of religion, race, gender, class, and I think we haven't done it very well since the 1980s. But we did it pretty darn well in the 1950s. Not the gender and race we were learning about, but think about Superman and the posters of Superman saying, listen, kids, if somebody says that religion doesn't belong in this high school, you tell them that's un-American, It doesn't have to be the narrative that we have written. We could take those same tools and write an inclusive narrative that supports democracy. And that's what I'm always trying to do. And I think people would actually prefer it, because like I say, I think most of us just want to get along with each other.
I think the other way that religion can be I think of religion as a sort of a force like dynamite. It can either be very destructive or also very powerful in forces for good. And I worry that the media's coverage of religion, not yours, the media's coverage of religion focuses almost exclusively on extremism and now on Christian nationalism. And that's clearly important for understanding the rise of right-wing violence. But it seems to me that part of the value of studying religion is to see that the practice of radical empathy for understanding the worldviews of other people is an important way to build precisely the kinds of democratic coalitions that you're talking about. And so I wonder if you see other ways in which that's happening in contemporary politics.
Okay, so I think there's a really important issue here that maybe ties into what we were talking about today about journalism.
Yeah.
And that's that, people get on my case all the time because I have started occasionally now to do it. I don't talk about the radical left in the United States. I don't talk about the radical left because they're not in power. If they were in power, I promise you, I would be all over them all the time. I write about the people who are in power. And one of the issues I have with what you're saying in terms of American politics is, and that's why I think Sean Fain is so interesting, is that the people who are in power are the Christian nationalists. And they have been so incredibly important right now with the ascension of Mike Johnson and with Ron DeSantis in Florida and Greg Abbott in Texas. They've changed the Republican Party from a party that focused on laissez-faire economics and market forces and small government to one that's calling for a very large government that affects every aspect of our lives, including getting away from market forces. So one of the things that I would really love to see is more attention, although I've done a bunch of searches on Fain and he does show up. But did anybody else know that he was taking a lot of his inspiration for the UAW contracts from his Christian faith? Yeah, like did you hear about that? That would have been useful to hear about. And I would like to see a lot more of that. But it's going to take a lot of people speaking up for his kind of social gospel, which right now just doesn't have any power. I mean, it's got him.
Right.
But it needs to have more power.
It's hard for me to know sometimes whether people just aren't listening to those stories. And there was a story in the Atlantic by Elizabeth Brunig just last month about that very issue and about him. So it seems to me, sometimes I don't know whether it's just that things are out there and people aren't paying attention to them. But as you point out, I think in such important ways, you look not only at people who are in power, but you think about the power of ordinary people and agency and how we can sort of increase the agency within local communities, within sort of other kinds of settings. And it seems to me religion provides at least some possibility, and it does happen that way. I was thinking the other day about Florida and about, when African American history, when the banning of African American history from teaching in public schools in Florida, who picked up the reins? The black churches did. And it's precisely in places like that where there is sort of local agency all the time. But I don't know, is the media just not focusing on that because they're too busy with the thunderstorms?
Well, I don't know because I'm not a part of that group, but I do think that there are an awful lot of stories that the media doesn't cover. And one of the big stories that I think we're not seeing, first of all, one of the things that religion has always done in the United States is it's empowered women, because that's a setting in which women feel comfortable. They often have long-standing connections in a church. And the thing that I've been watching lately is the degree to which the people in local communities are pushing back against Moms for Liberty, who are usually AstroTurf. They're not part of those communities. They come in from elsewhere. And people are, because school board meetings are places, and schools are places women feel comfortable. And I think that's a really important piece of that. Why doesn't the media report on it? I just think because those aren't their connections. And one of the things that jumps out to me always when we talk about stuff like this is the populist movement of the 1890s. Because, in the 1890s, especially if you were in the American West, it was miserable. There had been a terrible, terrible drought, and everybody was in debt, and they were all losing their farms. I paraphrase, but where I'm going here. And neither of the parties were paying much attention at all, especially the Republican Party, which was in power after 1889 and assumed that it was going to stay in power forever. We could go on at length about that because it's really interesting. But they started to organize, and not organize based in, we got to go back and fight. They organized, women organized, and said, do you understand how the tariffs work? Do you understand how kickbacks in the railroads work? And by the midterm elections of 1890, They were so powerful, they swept the West. They took the House of Representatives by 2 seats to 1 for the Republicans, 2-1 margin in the House of Representatives. They took the Senate, and there's this wonderful moment where all summer people have been writing to the people back east, the Republicans back east, and saying, we got real problems out here. We're not even running a candidate because we can't get anyone to run for us. We're in real trouble. And the election hit, and nobody back east saw it coming. They just didn't see it coming. And there's this wonderful letter. This woman visits President Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, who's in office at the time. And he was, just don't start me, but so they went in, they were in the garden outside the White House, and she said he just kept going, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I just know it wasn't my fault. But that's kind of sometimes what I feel about here is I feel like there's a lot of stuff going on that as historians we see, but that it's not necessarily making it into the papers.
Yeah, and that gets into some of the things we talked about too, about new technologies and social media and how certain things get amplified and other things don't, sort of make it to the top of our lists of things to read. So that's something to be sort of watchful for.
There are some people, especially coming from the Southern Baptists, that have very large social media followings. They're great. But now that you mention it, I don't think I've ever seen either one of the ones I'm thinking of in a major publication. And they have, millions of followers.
Yeah, I mean, religion news reporting generally is, in many of the major papers, just like international news reporting, the money has been sort of drawn away from some of those positions. So there aren't as many dedicated religion reporters in some places where it would be most useful. So that's part of the problem.
And again, you look at where there's an intersection between them and moving the levers of power. Because that's really where mainstream media is where the power lever's moving. And they're moving with the Mike Johnsons of the world right now.
Yeah. So any of you who want to go into religion news reporting, please consider
So when you
an
start
important
your new
profession.
political party, then you can have a religious reporter on staff.
Exactly. I think we're ready for some...
I'm really good at coming up with jobs for other people.
I know,
aren't
you're good at that.
So I've been
You're good
here
at
like
that.
12 hours, and I've already, there's this poor student here in the front. I'm like, I can get a job for you. And we were at dinner, and I'm like, well, that's a really good idea. One of you guys should do that.
You're a delegator. That's good.
Yeah, that's great.
I think we have some audience questions.
3 groups, general, specific issues, and closer.
Okay, let's see. Discuss the relationship between fact, logic, and emotion in shifting public opinions and attitudes.
What a wonderful question. That's actually one of the very few things that makes me bonkers every night. And that's how few Americans can think logically. And I'm guessing that whoever asks that question watches me on my webcasts. Because I always take a big issue and I'm like, let's divide this out and make sure everything is in the lane it belongs in. Because once you do that, it's really much easier to untangle everything. And otherwise, it's just like this ball of wire, and all you know is you're upset about it. You don't know how to divide it out. So that, I think, is a huge problem. And there's another logic problem in that, too, in that often when I write about something, that does not mean I am advocating for it. It means I'm recording that it happened. And people get really angry with me about it. And I'm not secret about it. I say, today, John Smith did this. And they're like, you and John Smith think. I'm like, no, I don't. I just wrote what he thinks. So that ability to look at a problem and say, let's take it and divide it out. Let's figure out who's got what piece of this problem and what they're trying to do. So I'm going to go there. I have been recording what the Biden administration, their position has been on the Middle East. That does not mean I support it. That means you need to understand what they're trying to do. Do I think it's going to work? Believe me, I'm an agnostic. But you need to know what they're doing. You can't just say this sucks and everybody's horrible, because there's no solution to that. You know, everybody should be nicer to each other is a really great position. It doesn't work, right? So the problem is that takes work, it takes background, and it's way easier to just make people upset. And that's what you see when there are confusing things that happen, not only, I mean, everywhere. You see immediate reactions saying, this upsets me. Because that's, you know, it gets clicks. You know about the whole engagement thing, right? On social media, you get the more engagement you get, the more profits you can make as an advertiser. And I guess I've never said this before. I get asked multiple times every single day to post advertising on my website, not my website, you know, on Facebook, because they know they'll get a lot of eyeballs. And believe me, I could make bank on that. They're offering huge sums of money, and obviously I won't do it. But there's a financial reward to get eyeballs on your site. So every time you click on one of those, somebody's putting money in their pocket. And that need to keep people riled up, rather than explaining to them, hey, wait a minute here, wait a minute. You need to see that these things happened here. And so one of the things that speaks to this, I think, is I love Joyce White Vance, the person who does legal stuff. There's a bunch of people I follow like that. But man, when they get into what happened at the latest hearing over the Section 6 of the fourth piece on the 65th, even I am glazed over. Nobody is getting extra clicks from those stories, right? It's really important that we know about them. But when you see, oh my God, did you hear what the latest thing is that I saw one just this afternoon? So-and-so admitted something huge. I thought, no, they didn't. You're just looking for clicks. So the relationship there, I think, is that understanding and logic takes time and effort, and it takes some understanding of a topic to say, here's this line, here's this line, here's this line, here's this line. These things you all need, and that's different from emotion. And that you need to separate those out, or you're going to get consumed by that emotion, and you're not going to understand these things, and you cannot make good decisions about your position in the world unless you do understand those things.
Another question. Do you feel the media will cover the next election fairly?
Okay, so let me answer that in a slightly sideways way. There is a big push in the media, primarily thanks to Jay Rosen of New York University, not to cover the odds but the stakes, as he says, because so many people have covered politics as a horse race. And I could tell you the history of how we got to that. It's actually not that interesting. If anybody cares, I can tell you. But we are not in a horse race election. We are in a survival of the United States election. And so if you had asked me that question 2 months ago, I'd have been like, just don't start me. But there's been such pressure. I don't know if you've noticed, in the last, I'm not great at times, 2 weeks, maybe? I don't know. There's been a number of major articles coming out in major places saying, oh boy, look, former President Trump and people like Trump say he's going to become a dictator. Look at this. Look at, and that's a huge change, because one of the things that has made historians' hair catch on fire was things like him referring to his opponents as vermin. You know, think about that. 10 years ago, that statement would have been headline news. Well, look at how many times they talked about Hillary Clinton talking about the basket of deplorables, right? And we've seen those statistics coming out. That was mentioned thousands and thousands more times than the vermin thing, right? Things strike me in this moment as beginning to change. So do I have faith that the reporters will cover this election fairly? I have more than I used to. I am a little bit concerned at how little experience some of our reporters have. And I was saying to someone today, and I think it's worth noting, the history of the White House pool is very different than the history of the other pools, which I have written about, by the way. But if you're really interested in knowing for sure what's going on in this country, the State Department and the Defense Department have really good pool reporters. They ask really good questions, they're really informed, and they really push on things. So if you really are not quite sure what's going on somewhere, State and Defense are the places to look.
Good to know.
And I'm sorry, that's free. It's literally state.gov, defense.gov. You go on the websites and you go to the press, they have daily press conferences.
Okay, another one about the presidency. Can you write another letter? This is a delegating question.
Great.
Can you write another letter highlighting all of the great things President Biden and the Democrats have done in the past 2 years? I need to save it and keep it handy for when I get in a discussion about this. I can't remember everything on my own.
So you know what? I will, but I'm gonna tell you something, and I hope she's watching, and she's probably not. Although maybe this is tipping our hand here. Somebody wrote to me the other day, this wonderful person wrote and said, I'm going to make cards that are talking points for the election. If you will put them on your website so people can print them out, I'm happy to do that. And I thought, that's a great idea. That's absolutely a great idea. So she's working on that now. But in the way the universe works, I was on a train 3 days ago, and I was reading a book. I was talking about this at dinner. I was reading a book about women in the New Deal and how they sold FDR's policies in 1936 when it was not at all clear he was going to win the election. And you know what they did? This woman, Molly Dewson, do you know who she is?
No.
Honest to God, I'd never heard of her. But she was like in the thick of everything. Started a group of women around the country who did exactly that. And they called them rainbow flyers, and they left them around the country for people to pick up and say, oh, look what FDR did. And then the other side was what the Republicans had done. And I thought, there's nothing new under the sun. I am certain that the person who is going to do this for us does not know about Molly Dewson. I did not know about Molly Dewson. So I will write another letter like that, but I think this is just such a brilliant idea. And this is about agency, and this is about democracy. And somebody said to me once, you're just preaching to the choir. First of all, I'm getting a lot of people from places you wouldn't expect reading to me, but my answer to that came from another reader. And I said, of course I'm preaching to the choir. You preach to the choir because the choir sings.
All right. Has there ever been another time in history when public schools have been under attack as they are today? As a retired public school teacher, I am worried, since I view a well-educated populace as a cornerstone of democracy. This push toward privatization will create a larger gap between the haves and have-nots.
That's a great question, especially here in Missouri. Where, of course, you're facing the voucher system, right, that is sweeping the country. Has there been a period when they are so under attack? I'm going to answer that yes, but before I answer that yes, I'm going to tell you, one, I'm working on a letter about the voucher system. And we don't really have time to go into all of that. I assume a lot of you know about it. If you don't, follow Jess Piper, who talks a lot about it and what it means. She's not here tonight, is she? Jess, are you here? Worth a check. So, of course, the thing about public school, do you ever know why we had why France developed the Tour de France? Yeah, somebody knows this story. Because they wanted people to feel like they were part of a country. And they did two things. They did the Tour de France, which goes around France. So you could follow, in the newspapers in those days, it wasn't televised early on. You could follow through the newspapers and you could learn about all the different regions in your country. And they also developed a public school curriculum that was all over the country because it would create a sense of nationhood. And we are not only losing every piece of education that public school entails, I think it is a deliberate attack on nationhood to take away our public schools, even though our schools have always been determined by state. Have we been here before? Yes, we have been here before in a very different way that almost nobody knows about, and I've never written about it, but someday maybe I will. Many people don't know this, but after the Civil War, after the land-grant college acts had been so incredibly successful at bringing higher education to people whose fathers weren't wealthy, because until then, you had to have a wealthy father to send you to college. The Republicans in Congress tried to set up public schools across the country, especially in the American South, where there had not been public schools before the Civil War. There had only been private schools, right? But the trick to this in 1866 was that it was not divided by region. The way that the money would be apportioned was by illiteracy. So a huge amount of the money for public schools was going to go to the border states as well as to the American South. And people were desperate for educations. They were desperate for educations in 1866, which is when this first goes into a law. Andrew Johnson vetoes that law because he says that the United States has never been involved in public education, and this is a complete overreach. Of course, it was exactly the same argument that they had used to put in place the land-grant college acts just 4 years before. But when he does that, he kills the idea of public education and public schools in the American South and in the border states until the 1890s, which is when we finally get at least the establishment within the government, not of a cabinet level position, but of a Department of Education. And that deliberate decision that rather than giving people the educations they craved, because it would mean that they would not continue to vote for the Democratic Party of which he was a part, I think is not dissimilar from the idea that you keep people from being educated, you keep people manipulatable, and you make sure that certain people stay in power. So I don't think that's an illegitimate comparison, but it worries me terribly. It worries me terribly. Not only the voucher system, but also, as many of you know, not all homeschooling is dangerous. Some of it's terrific, but there's a large percentage of homeschoolers really beginning in a really interesting way in the 1960s under Nixon, and then snowballing, of course, in the 70s and 80s into the present. You know, millions of kids who are being homeschooled, and they're being homeschooled with really dangerous curriculum that most people don't even know exists. I did a deep dive on it once because you know who's written a bunch of it and has made bank on it is Huckabee. He has his own curriculum. Well, you must know this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, another worrisome topic.
Are we having fun yet?
With the latest decision from the Florida Appeals Court re the gerrymandered districts, how concerned should we be about potential interventions of the United States Supreme Court over other states of concern?
Okay, so let me cut to the chase on a couple of things here. In a free and fair vote in this country, I have absolutely no doubt that we will protect our democracy and expand it. I just have no doubt of that, none. And I could give you the statistics that suggest that's the case. From the polls, it suggests the vast majority of us agree even on hot-button issues, against the fact that Democrats tend to win the popular vote for president. They tend to win statewide votes. They have won special elections since June of 2022. But even though Democratic members of Congress for the House of Representatives consistently get more votes than the Republican candidates, Republicans continue to hold majorities, usually in the House of Representatives, because of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering now is on steroids. And one of the things that frustrates me terribly is that, we're kind of like the frogs in the pots. We should be fighting the gerrymandering every freaking day. We should be in the streets every freaking day. Because if you look at places like Michigan, where they finally managed to get maps in place that still slightly favored Republicans, not because anybody was being mean, but because of the way the population is distributed in Michigan. Once they got rid of those extraordinarily gerrymandered maps, they had a trifecta of Democrats who are putting in place incredibly popular laws. So one of the things about this is there's such a backlog of things people want done. Once you get a Democrat in power, they put in things that people actively want as opposed to are getting forced down their throats. And so how worried should we be? I am very worried. I am very worried. First, on the idea that the Supreme Court said, I forget how many years ago, a year or 2 years ago, that the federal government cannot stop in to stop partisan gerrymandering, that's okay. And now the fact that they're chipping away on the other kinds of gerrymandering in the states, including the idea, I think is pointing out that individuals can't sue under the Voting Rights Act. Most of the lawsuits are under the Voting Rights Act, are launched by individuals, not by states. It's a real problem. It's a real problem. And of course, you know that John Roberts began his political career on voting the Gutting Rights Act. Gutting the Voting Rights Act, if I said that wrong. It's been a long day. So I'm very worried about that. I'm very worried about that. And one of the things I keep saying to people is that it's so much easier to stop the rise of an authoritarian before he takes power. And all these people are like, if something goes bad, they're going to be on the streets the day after the election. We need to fix it before the election so we don't have to be out there the day after the election. All that to say, yeah, I'm worried.
Yeah. Well, we're going to end on a higher note than that. So if, as we discussed, democracy is a process, not a finished product, it is one that requires strength to boost ourselves when we are feeling most anxious or unsettled. You speak directly to that question so well. And I would love to hear you close us out by talking about what we can do when we are feeling overwhelmed by political news that discourages us. How do we keep pushing and finding sources of energy when we feel most hopeless?
So first of all, it's okay to take a break. There are lots of people like, you got to be in the fight all the time. And I'm like, just breathing is sometimes a triumph. And it's okay to garden and to go out with your friends and to just give yourself a break. And one of my favorite stories about this is, people always talk about heroes, and one of the things that worries me about things like the Florida curriculum is that it turns everything into these heroes who come up, from the head of Zeus and suddenly save us all. And the truth is that somebody once asked me what a hero was, and I had written the Wounded Knee book, and there aren't a lot of heroes in Wounded Knee. And I thought about it for a long time, and I realized that there were two heroes in it. There was Sitting Bull, and there was George Crook, who was one of the early Army officers. He dies early on. And that seems funny, right? But I realized that being a hero is getting up every day and doing the right thing. And there's this wonderful story of these 4 women in the Philippines during World War II, and they become known as the Angels of the Underground because they saved so many people. And you think, wow, they saved the Philippines. Like, they must have been these incredible women. No. One of them becomes a hero because she's being rounded up by the Japanese. They're all supposed to go and have their names signed in this book, and then they're all supposed to go home, right? That's what the occupiers say is going to happen. She goes with everybody else, and she has a panic attack. She can't stay. She's having a panic attack, and all her friends say, no, come on, just stay, get your name in the book. And she's like, no, I have to go home. So she goes home. Everybody else gets rounded up and taken away, and there she is in her apartment, alone for weeks with nothing to do but hide and look out the window and watch who all the Japanese officers are and where they're moving. She becomes an angel of the underground because she had a panic attack. We can do that. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is it's really okay just to be a decent human being sometimes, and then to come back to this fight, first of all. But what keeps me going is you. I never forget how lucky I am to be doing what I do and to be part of this amazing community. And I want to remind you that if you were an American living in 1853, democracy was over. You knew it was over. The elite enslavers had the presidency, they had the Supreme Court, they had the Senate, they'd made inroads on the House of Representatives. 1854, they took the House of Representatives and they put through a law that moved enslavement to the American West, where new slave states would work with the slave states in the South to take over the North, turn the American government into an oligarchy that was going to rule the world. And they said that. If you read Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, that's exactly what he says is going to happen. They have gotten rid of that silly idea that all men are created equal. He says that. We're going to have a new, much more important government in which people like us run it. And we have more money and more power than anybody else in the world, and we'll take care of those little people over there. Americans looked at each other after 1854 and said, listen, we don't agree about finance, we don't agree about immigration, we don't agree about internal improvements, but by God, we can agree that we care about American democracy. By 1856, they had a new political party, they had the Republicans. By 1859, Abraham Lincoln said, wait a minute, maybe government shouldn't work just for a very few rich people, it should work for everybody, and it should make sure people starting out in society have access to education and to resources. And maybe it should work for all of us and not just for a very few people. By 1860, Americans had put him into the White House. By 1863, he had ended the system of human enslavement in the United States. And by November of 1863, he gave the Gettysburg Address, vowing that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from this earth, and vowing a new birth of freedom. Less than 10 years, they went from the rich guys get it all to we're rebuilding this country on the idea that we are all created equal and have a right to have a say in our government. And Lincoln was a brilliant man, but he didn't do that by himself. He did it by those people who looked at each other in 1854 and 1855 and 1856 and 1857 and said, you know, I don't agree with you about a lot of stuff. Don't even necessarily like you very much. And after all this is over, we're going to fight about things all over again. But in this moment, we know we need to protect our legacy. We need to protect American democracy. And they did it. So when I look out in this moment, a crisis moment at least as powerful as that one, I think they did it when only white propertied men could vote. And if they could do it then, we can do it today. And that's why I'm here.
Heather, I am so grateful to you and for this discussion, for our chance to have this conversation, and for all the work that you're doing to educate people and to remind them of this long democratic process. It's such enormously important work for all of us, and you have left us with a great deal to think about. So let's give another thanks to our...
Thank you all for everything you're doing.